She was buried with no heartbeat, a cold body, and a signed death certificate. Days later, she knocked on her own front door, year 1705, Lurgan, Ireland. Margorie McCall was the wife of a doctor, a devoted mother, and apparently dead. The funeral took place the very same day. But what no one knew was that Margorie was still alive. The mistake? Fatal? The comeback? Impossible to explain. Her grave became legend. And what happened that night still defies medical logic. If stories like this send chills down your spine, subscribe to Medical Mystery Files. But be warned, this story isn't for the faint of heart. Now hold your breath. What you're about to hear begins with a pain in the chest. It all started with a pain in the chest. Margorie McCall was known for her kindness, her easy smile, and the way she welcomed each of her husband's patients with sweet words and a warm cup of tea. She lived in Lurgan, a small village in Ireland, where everyone knew their neighbors' names, and also the rumors that spread faster than the morning sun. In the summer of 1705, the world was a different place. There were no antibiotics, no defibrillators, no medical imaging. When someone got sick, it became a race against time, and often against fate itself. Margorie fell ill suddenly. First a mild dizziness, then a fever, followed by uncontrollable shivers. Within 2 days, she could barely sit up in bed. Her eyes were sunken, her lips dry, and her breathing short. Her husband, John McCall, did all he could. But even as a doctor, he was helpless. Hour by hour, he watched the woman he loved slipping through his fingers, until one silent morning, her heart simply stopped. She was only 35 years old. Grief struck immediately and brutally. John, devastated, decided to bury her that very day. It wasn't unusual at the time. Contagious diseases could wipe out entire families in a matter of days, and fear of infection often led to rushed burials. No one questioned it. The ceremony was brief. A few elderly friends, a shaken family. The coffin was sealed and taken to Shankle Cemetery, a damp, silent field surrounded by twisted trees and moss-covered stone crosses. But there was one detail no one could ignore. Margorie had been buried with her gold wedding ring. At the time, burying someone with jewelry was considered risky, not just due to superstition, but because of a very real threat. The body snatchers. These men had no mercy. Under the cover of night, they would dig up freshly buried corpses in search of anything valuable. Gold, teeth, even clothing. If it held worth, it was taken. And if it didn't come off easily, they cut. John knew this, but he couldn't bring himself to remove the ring from his wife's cold hand. He said it was a symbol of eternal love, that even in death, she would still be his. That very night, the skies over Lurgan turned black. Rain poured down, and footsteps began to echo between the graves. 2 men, their names lost to time, moved through the tombstones with shovels on their shoulders and hunger in their eyes. Margorie's grave was fresh, the soil still damp. A perfect target. They worked fast, silently, like ghosts beneath the earth. In minutes, they cracked open the coffin. There she was, pale, motionless, the golden ring gleaming on her ring finger. But there was a problem. The ring wouldn't come off. They tried pulling, twisting. Nothing. One whispered something, then pulled a small knife from his pocket. They'd have to cut the finger. He grabbed her hand and began to make the cut, but just before the blade touched her skin, her eyes opened. What happened next was never fully explained. But one thing is certain. The men dropped everything and ran. One screamed, the other collapsed to his knees. Some say one of the thieves went mad and was found days later muttering, "She saw me. She saw me." Margorie was alive. This wasn't just a folktale whispered through generations. Records from the 18th century mention the event, and her original headstone, which still exists today, bears a chilling inscription: "Lived once, buried twice." No one knows exactly how long Margorie was unconscious. Some believe she suffered from a condition now known as catalepsy, a form of extreme paralysis that mimics death. Others say the imminent cut triggered a massive adrenaline surge that jump-started her heart. But in that cold, silent moment inside the open grave, only one thing mattered. Margorie was breathing alone, in the dead of night, covered in soil and confusion. She rose from the coffin and climbed out of her own grave. Step by step, barefoot, she walked through the village. And that was where the legend began. Because the most unbelievable part was still to come. The rain kept falling as the two men ran from the cemetery like they had just seen the devil himself rise from the earth. And in their minds, that's exactly what had happened. In 18th century Ireland, the line between the world of the living and the dead was much thinner than it is today. Stories of ghosts, curses, and nighttime apparitions were as common as recipes for homemade bread. But even by the standards of that time, what happened that night was unbearable. The two grave robbers never imagined the woman they buried would be alive. The first, a burly man with calloused hands, sprinted to the edge of the cemetery, vaulted over the stone wall, and vanished. He was never seen again. The second tripped in the mud, slammed into a headstone, and injured his shoulder. They say he froze for a moment, staring at the figure slowly rising from the coffin. Margorie, pale, covered in dirt, hair stuck to her face, the wedding ring still on her finger. The silence was absolute, only the sound of rain hitting the leaves. The woman, who everyone believed to be dead, simply looked at them. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stared, like someone waking from a nightmare, unsure if they'd really woken up. The man screamed. The blade fell from his hand. He dropped to his knees, crossed his fingers, and began to pray. Then, staggering, he disappeared into the graves. Margorie, meanwhile, stood still for a few minutes, disoriented. Her body ached. Her breath was shallow. But she was alive. And she could feel everything. With great effort, she climbed up the side of the grave. The wet soil crumbled beneath her feet. Her hands bled as they gripped the roots. But she climbed and made it out. It was raining hard. The village was empty. It was past midnight. She began to walk. Each step was a victory against the impossible. With her dress torn and her feet bare, Margorie made her way from Shankill Cemetery to her home, like a silent apparition. The houses were locked. Dogs barked in the distance. A flash of lightning lit the sky, and her face, for a single moment. Reaching her front door, she hesitated. She was weak, cold, but she knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Inside, John McCall was asleep in a chair, his face swollen from crying. He heard the sound and staggered to his feet, dazed. Who would knock at this hour? He opened the door. And fainted. The sight of his wife, the woman he had buried 2 days earlier, now standing before him alive, or at least looking alive, was more than his mind could take. Margorie stumbled inside, sat down on the wooden floor leaning against the wall. She was exhausted, but alive. When John came to, he didn't say a word. He just embraced her, cried, touched her face as if afraid she'd vanish. Then he carried her to bed, covered her with blankets. And the two of them spent the rest of the night in silence, like two people who had just watched the world end and begin again. The next morning, the news spread. And Lurgan descended into chaos. Some called it a miracle. Others witchcraft. Some swore Margorie was possessed. A priest was summoned. Neighbors peered through windows. One man even knelt in the street, begging forgiveness for sins he couldn't remember. The little village wasn't emotionally prepared for what had happened. At the tavern, the tale grew with every pint. She rose from the grave, speaking, in tongues. I saw it with my own eyes. It wasn't her. It was a spirit. The husband made a pact, traded his soul for eternal love. But John McCall stood his ground. He simply said, she wasn't dead, and now she's alive. That's all you need to know. To protect his wife, he decided to move away. Quietly, they left town a few weeks later. They lived the following years far from prying eyes, and far from the legends. But Margorie's grave remained. Empty. And with it, the story grew like wild. Over time, new versions appeared. Some said Margorie later died a natural death. Others claimed she was buried again, in the same place, under a new headstone. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because when researchers visited Shankill Cemetery, they found the gravestone, and on it was written, Margorie McCall, lived once, buried twice. No date, no explanation, no official record confirming a second burial. And that cryptic inscription is all we have. But what does it mean? Did Margorie really die later? Or did she never die at all? Did someone at some point open that coffin again? In the heart of Ireland, between mist and myth, the story of that night still lingers like an echo among the tombstones. But now, we need to go back once more, to the night. Margorie walked, alive, through the very streets where people had already mourned her death. Because what she found at home was just the beginning of something even stranger. The next morning, the sun rose as if nothing had happened. Birds were singing. Steam rose from the wet earth in soft spirals. But inside the McCall household, time stood still. Margorie was sleeping. And John was just watching her. It was a miracle before his very eyes. The woman he loved, the one he had wept for, held vigil over, and buried with his own hands, was now breathing. Her pulse was faint but steady. Her heart beat slow but strong. She was there. And he couldn't stop staring. In that moment, John was no longer a doctor. He was a husband, a man, a soul facing the impossible, trying not to lose his grip on reality. But Lurgan was on fire. Just after sunrise, a group of neighbors knocked at the door. They wanted to see, to touch, to confirm with their own eyes that the dead woman had returned. John turned them away. He said Margorie needed rest, that she was still weak, and that any noise could harm her. But no one believed him. The news spread like wildfire through dry fields. Within hours, strangers from nearby villages arrived. They wanted to witness the returned dead. Some came with faith, others with fear, but all came with one certainty. Something unexplainable had happened in that house. On the second day, a church official showed up. His eyes were cold, his voice solemn. If she died and came back, we must ensure no demonic influence is involved. John, politely but firmly, refused entry. He said his wife was not a spectacle, she was a person, and that if he had to defend her honor with his life, he would do so without hesitation. The priest left, but not without a veiled threat. Miracles and curses walk hand in hand, Doctor. History will judge you both. And it did. As days passed, the pressure mounted. There was no hiding Margorie for long. People whispered on street corners. Children were forbidden from walking past the house. Shopkeepers refused to sell the family any food. To the villagers, this was no longer a miracle. It was a defiance of death itself. On the third night, Margorie fully woke up. She sat up in bed and asked for water. Her voice was weak, but clear. John dropped to his knees. He wept like never before. He asked if she remembered anything. She answered, "I remember the fever, the pain, and the darkness. After that, just shadows, a cut, and the sound of rain." John hesitated. "Do you remember being in the grave?" Margorie looked at him, then at her own hand, where the wedding ring still shone. "I don't remember dying, John, but I remember waking up in the middle of the earth." He hugged her, held her as if she might disappear at any second. The next morning, John made a decision. It was time to leave. In secret, he arranged everything. He sold the house, asked an old friend for help securing transport, and in a silent pre-dawn hour, he placed Margorie in a covered cart along with a few belongings. They left without telling anyone. Lurgan awoke to an empty house. The grave remained. Empty. And the story. Without an ending. What happened after that? Few truly know. John and Margorie settled in Dublin, a city large enough to disappear in. There he found work as a medical assistant. And she, though still frail, returned to a quiet life, tending the home, writing letters, picking flowers in the garden. Years passed. Margorie regained her health, and her smile. She never spoke publicly about what happened, but she kept a journal. In it she wrote scattered thoughts, broken phrases, as if trying to secretly piece together the fragments of that void between life and death. Once, John read one of her entries. "Death has no sound, no smell, it's just absence. But when you come back from it, everything gains weight, even silence." Margorie died years later, of natural causes this time. With doctors, with witnesses, with no doubts. She was buried peacefully in a quiet cemetery far from Lurgan. John ordered a simple headstone, no cryptic messages, just her name, the dates, and a single carved rose. But the past, as always, has a way of knocking on the door. Decades later, the McCall house in Lurgan was sold to a new family. During renovations, they discovered something strange hidden beneath the wooden floorboards. A small box sealed with wax. Inside was a letter. It was from Margorie. Addressed to whoever finds this. It read, "If you're reading this, it means the house is breathing again. I have been where few return from. I offer no answers, only memories. Life is made of returns, and sometimes the impossible finds its way home." That letter is now preserved in a small local museum, protected behind glass, beside a replica of the original headstone bearing the inscription that has echoed for over 3 centuries. Buried once, lived twice. And with that, we arrive at the final line of a nearly impossible journey. Or perhaps just the beginning of something even deeper. Because the true mystery, as you're about to see, didn't end with Margorie. No matter how much Margorie McCall rebuilt her life far from Lurgan's curious eyes, her grave never truly rested. Decades passed. Time covered the headstones in moss, names faded, stories turned to dust, but hers remained alive. The original grave at Shankill Cemetery stood untouched. No body, no bones, just the stone. And carved into it, firmly, deliberately, the phrase that raised more questions than answers. Buried once, lived twice. But who put that inscription there? That's the first unanswered question. John McCall never confirmed it. There are no official records linking him to the headstone, and he never returned to Lurgan after leaving. But someone commissioned that carving. Some historians suggest it was a relative. Others say it may have been one of the village gravediggers, someone who witnessed everything and decided to leave behind a confession, or preserve the truth. What we do know is that, for years, the headstone attracted the curious. scholars, priests, skeptics. They all came to see the grave that held nothing. It was an empty grave. And yet, it was full of stories. In 1869, more than a century after Margorie's resurrection, a group of local archaeologists decided to investigate. With permission from both the church and the city, they opened the grave to examine its contents. They hoped to find something: coffin remains, artifacts, any physical trace of the original burial. But what they found was hollow. There was nothing. No wood, no fabric, no signs of decomposition. Nothing. It was as if no one had ever been buried there at all. The discovery triggered a new storm of theories. Some claimed the remains had completely decomposed, which technically was possible, but the total lack of any trace was strange. Even for that time, others went further. They claimed Margorie had never been buried there, that it was all a story built on a mistake and amplified by village folklore, that perhaps she had merely fainted, and someone found it convenient to fuel the myth. But then, why the headstone? And more importantly, if she was never buried, why did two supposed grave robbers flee in terror that night? In 1921, a researcher named Thomas Beasley published a small book titled Shadows at 8. Shankill, in which he proposed a chilling theory. The grave of Margorie McCall is not about death. It is about our fear of not understanding it. No matter how much evidence we search for, what terrifies us most is that she might have actually come back. As the decades rolled on, the story took on almost supernatural overtones. Some claimed to see a woman's figure wandering the graveyard on rainy nights. Others swore they heard knocking from beneath the earth. In 1983, a group of Canadian tourists visited the cemetery and reported something bizarre. As they approached Margorie's grave, their cell phones, though rare at the time, shut off without warning. Back at the hotel, the devices were fine. Coincidence? Or just another page in the legend. But the most mysterious moment came in 2004. During a government restoration of the cemetery, a worker was digging near Margorie's headstone when he found a second coffin. Small, shallow, and old. Inside, a female skeleton with a gold wedding ring still on her finger. Forensic analysis suggested the woman had died between 1730 and 1740. But the local records didn't match. No burial of a woman was registered in that period. No name, no clue. Nothing. The skeleton was catalogued as unknown female number 104, but to the villagers there was no doubt Margorie had returned, lived, died again, and this time was buried in secret. And this time she stayed. The discovery reignited. The Legend. TV crews came to film. Scientific journals published articles with provocative titles: The Woman Who Died Twice, The Ghost of Lurgan, The Mistake That Became Immortality. But in truth, no one could explain it. Perhaps that's why the story never faded, because it doesn't end neatly or cleanly or satisfyingly. It ends with silence. And a grave. Today, visitors to Shankill Cemetery will find a discreet plaque recently placed beside the original headstone. It reads, "This is the resting place of Margorie McCall. Buried once. They say she lived twice. The truth? She took it with her. Many still go there. Some bring flowers, others stones, and some just sit in silence before the grave. Because there are stories that don't need proof. Only respect. And the case of Margorie McCall remains one of the greatest medical mysteries ever recorded, not because of tests, reports, or autopsies, but because it defies the very nature of life. And death. But the question that still echoes today is simple. If you woke up inside a coffin, what would you do? Margorie McCall was buried alive, But that's not what made her eternal. What keeps her alive to this day is the doubt. Did she really come back from the dead? Or was it the world around her that never truly understood what happened? Was it catalepsy, a miracle, a tragic mistake, or a dark warning about human fallibility? Medicine has come a long way. Today we have monitors, scans, precise diagnostics. But in 1705, all it took was a longer silence, a missed heartbeat, a breath no one noticed, and the verdict was final. Dead. How many Margories were buried? Beneath the earth, with no second chance? Maybe the real horror of this story isn't the empty grave, but the thought that death can sometimes be mistaken for life. And that, waking up too late, is a fate far crueler than dying. So I ask you, what if it were you in that coffin? Would you have the strength to knock on the lid, or would you wait, hoping someone might come? Back for you? If this story moved you, subscribe to Medical Mystery Files. Because the human body hides secrets, and medicine still doesn't have all the answers.